The Lord is good. His mercy endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. Amen. Friends, he laid there in the hospital room bed, hanging on by a thread. There were needles throughout his entire body, pumping all manner of fluids into them to rehydrate him because of the massive dehydration that he suffered. As he opened his eyes, he saw his mother and his father on each side of him. And when he came to his senses, he realized his situation. The magnitude of desolation wafted over him with this reverberating voice in his head that was his own. You didn't know how to live, and now you don't even know how to die. He grew up in India, born into the highest Hindu priestly class order a person can be born into. And like every young Indian man, it was beat into him that his value and worth was all connected to his success in life. Though he went to one of the most prestigious universities in India, he was still questioned. He still had doubts. He still was looking for meaning and purpose and answers, and he found none. And one day, he was in the chemistry lab, and he went in there, and he grabbed every vial he could that read poison on the label. He took it home. The next day, he waited for mom and dad to leave to go to work. He waited for his siblings to go off for school, and then he locked the door behind them. He went into the restroom. He grabbed a glass, filled it with water, took all those vials of poison, and dumped it inside the glass. Immediately, there was a chain reaction, and the thing started to froth over. So he took a spoon and stirred it around. He opened his mouth, and he chugged. The doctors told him, thank God it was salted, because his body began to reject it. He was able to grab a hold of that porcelain sink and utter out one phrase before he collapsed. Help! Somehow, the house servant was able to bust through the doors, load him in the vehicle, and take him to the hospital. While he was lying there in the hospital wing, a minister came into that wing with this little tiny red Bible containing the New Testament only. And he wanted to share with that man who tried to take his own life a message. His mother stopped him, though, and said, he's too weak, he can't do it. And so the minister made markings in the Bible and gave it to the mother and said, give it to him. When the man was well enough and strong enough to grab a hold of it, and his eyes were working straight, he opened to that page that was marked. It was John chapter 14. It was the discourse of Jesus with the Apostle Thomas. The very apostle who traveled to India long ago to share the message of Jesus with his Hindu ancestors. He read verse by verse until he got to verse 19. Heart beat. And when he did, the words of Jesus pierced his heart. Jesus wasn't just speaking to Thomas. He was speaking to all people. He was speaking to that young man who tried to take his life. And the words that choked his heart were, because I live, you also will live. If you've never been to India or know nothing about it, India is one of the most religious countries in all the world. It has every Eastern religion you can possibly think about. It has pockets of Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and a small portion of Catholicism. It is a nation that has some of the most adherent followers of every worldview. It's also a nation that has some of the wealthiest people in the world. And along with that, it has some of the poorest people in the world. It is a people and a culture that is identified by either ultimate success or overwhelming shame and guilt. And it's not a problem that's just unique to them. If we open our eyes and look at the world today, and we look at people, whether they're in our communities, in our countries, or across the globe, there's a global systemic problem that exists. And that problem is aimlessness. People are lost. And it's not new. It existed during the time of Jesus and his disciples. It existed for that young Indian boy who tried to take his life, and it still exists for us today. When we think of Jesus, we think of a guy who was busy, a guy who had purpose, a guy who had vision. And that vision would culminate on the hilltop of Calvary and the cross. And yet, the journey there was not without direction or care. Everywhere Jesus went, everywhere he went, he drew a crowd. They were drawn to the guy from Nazareth. They were drawn to one who taught with authority. They were drawn to one whose words and actions matched. Everywhere he went, people followed him. Whether they left from the Jordan to Capernaum, from Capernaum throughout the Decapolis in the southern area of Galilee, or across the Gennesaret Sea to the other side, they followed him. Jesus sure knew how to draw a crowd. And he wasn't selective either. He didn't show favoritism. He didn't cater to the wealthy, the popular, the powerful, the elite. He went into the streets and he looked for the common populace. He walked to the streets and he looked for the wounded. He looked for the troubled. He looked for the outcasts. And when he found them, he didn't just see a bunch of people that were hurting. He didn't just see a bunch of people that were suffering from all manners of diseases and infirmities and disfigurations. He saw a people, like everyone else, that had the most dire need ignored. Ignored by the very people that were supposed to lift them up and encourage them and support them and teach them and equip them and inform them of where true life can be found. What true life is defined by, what answers ultimately are needed to deal with the most difficult of questions. When he looked at them, he said he saw them and they were harassed and helpless. The idea, the imagery being that of a sheep that is shoved down into the ground and has its flesh torn from its bones as it kicks and flails trying to escape the thorn bushes. That's how he saw people in the world. Tearing themselves apart, looking for answers, looking for meaning, looking for purpose. Jesus met people where they were, because there was nobody else that would. And as the disciples stood there looking at Jesus, perhaps their vision was skewed when they gazed at him. Perhaps it was blocked because of the dirty, dangly, disease-ridden hands that desperately reached out to Jesus just to grab a hold of his cloak, just to grab onto his ankle and kiss his feet, just to perhaps touch him, and everything would be better. Jesus didn't just make time for people. He made people his time. When he encountered the wounded, he stopped and he healed. When he passed by the troubled, he scooped them up and he comforted them. When he laid his eyes on the neglected and the rejected, he embraced them. He accepted people where they were. And after they encountered him, after they listened to him, they were not the same. We can almost imagine the gospel writer Matthew writing this years later to the lost sheep of Israel and to us today, choked up and quivering as he writes the ink into the papyrus, remembering the loving eyes of the Savior gazing upon the people and recalling how that kind man stepped into his house when no one else would dare to approach him. Perhaps as he gazed Jesus looking longingly at the masses, he remembered the reception he received from that kind man. Even though Jesus was the guest in his house. You see, when Jesus looked at people, he didn't have ulterior motives. He didn't look at them and think, what a useless sack of flesh that takes up space. He looked at them and saw the once crown of his creation, and how far we had fallen from grace. He looked at those who were supposed to be created in his image, and yet when he gazed at them, nothing was recognizable. When Jesus locked eyes with the people that he was serving, he had compassion on them. His heart went out for them. He was a people person. He loved people. He loves people. He's invested in people. He doesn't just think that people are problems or inconveniences. He looks at them as individuals who are confused and lost and hurting and struggling under the weight of their own suffering, needing guidance, needing help, needing to be gathered together and directed to him. Because they're suffering under the weight of their own conditions or their own choices. Friends, so often when we hear that wonderful, beautiful phrase that everyone in the world knows, whether you're a skeptic or a Christian, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. When we hear that, how regrettable that we forget the collective nature of the world he came to save. Because Jesus didn't come for a globe, he came for the people that are inside it. He came for people that are individuals, who have their own personhood. He came for people like you and me, people that he loves, people that he longed for, people that he came to show kindness to. And it's that kindness that draws our attention to him. It's through that compassion that he reaches out his arms to us, to meet ours, clinging up to him in faith and hope. And he doesn't leave us sitting there, desperate in the streets, dirty and dejected. But he grabs a hold of us. He lets us know that he's seen our misery. He knows what we're suffering. He's aware of what's coming. And he holds on tight and says, "My children, it's not bigger than me." He grabs a hold of our faces, no matter how much we try and pull away. And he says, "I'm aware of your pain. I know what plagues your mind. I know what has struck your heart. I know what has contaminated your spirit. I'm the solution." Friends, just like Matthew, we get the privilege of not rejoicing in the fact that we welcome him into our lives. But it's the other way around, where he welcomed us into his. That he saw us from the moment of eternity, saw our birth, saw our moment of knowledge of his presence, and rejoiced. Rejoiced to invite us into his house, to his life, to experience his love, his kindness, not just in mere words, not just in miraculous ways, but in the simplest way of just being there. Of finding us in the darkest of moments and holding us ever so tightly. And just like Matthew, we get the privilege of reflecting that same kindness and compassion of Jesus. We get the privilege of looking at other people and seeing them as Jesus saw them. We get the privilege of looking on people and loving people. We get the privilege of looking on people and being invested in people. We get the opportunity to use our words and our actions to uplift them, encourage them, and instruct them, instead of tear them down and berate them and make them feel worthless. We get the opportunity to see the lost and show them the way, to show them Jesus. We get the gift of viewing individuals as people, not projects. Of seeing them as neighbors, not pew fillers. Of seeing them as people in whom God has individually come to save and to love, and hold in his tender hand. When we look at the world today, the nature of existence has not changed. There will be those who sit and question why we love the dejected, the neglected, and the despised. There will be those who mock other people because of their appearance, because of their presence, because of their language, or because of their actions, simply based off of their own insecurities, their own ignorance, and their own arrogance. There will be people whom we want nothing more than to shower with love and will not mind. And yet, like Jesus, we love despite their lovelessness. Like Jesus, we shower with compassion regardless if it's reciprocated, for no other reason than the intrinsic worth of every individual in the eyes of God. Because it's that worth that has been ascribed to us by the same Jesus that came to save us and came to save them. That Indian man who tried to take his own life because he lacked purpose eventually received his answer. He got purpose. The life that he lived was a life that was connected to Jesus, the same as ours. And the opportunity that he was given with that life, he was able to reach millions and millions and millions of people all around the world. In universities, dictators, presidents, prime ministers, skeptics, and pagans. His name was Ravi Zacharias, and he was one of the greatest Christian apologists to defend the Christian faith. And solely because of that wonderful news that had been shared with him. Because I live, you also will live. Friends, lift up your heads and open your eyes. See the fields. They're bountiful. The harvest is ripe with people that are hurting and lost and confused and needing compassion that only you can give. Because it's the compassion that you have experienced. It is the kindness that you have received from their Savior and yours. God's storehouse is open. Grab a sickle and hit the fields. Because God's ready for them. And so are you. Amen.